Good day and welcome to the CIM's Indigenous webinar series, brought to you by the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee. Today, we are going to be speaking with industry leaders as part of our session on cross-industry perspectives on Indigenous inclusion. My name is Cassandra Spence, and on behalf of the CIM, I want to thank you for joining us today for this series of webinars focused on the relationship between Indigenous peoples and industry. And today, industry leaders from outside of the mining industry will be sharing their insights and thoughts regarding best practices for Indigenous inclusion. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining the call from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I would also like to take a moment to recognize the National Day of Awareness of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. According to the Assembly of First Nations, Indigenous women are 3 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be victims of violence. And I encourage us all to take a moment to reflect on this and look for opportunities to raise awareness and take action for change in our communities. And so now, some housekeeping before we begin. I'd ask everyone to stay on mute during the panel discussion, as too much background noise can make effective communication more difficult. And if you have questions or comments for the panel, I'd ask you to please type them into the chat box addressed to our Zoom host, Lorena Terre, and we will address as many as possible at the end of the discussion. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome our moderator for this session, Colleen Kelly. Colleen is a community engagement and public consultation professional with a focus on Indigenous relations, stakeholder management, communications, and media relations. She's a manager of community collaboration at Hatch, working with clients on engagement programs for a range of industries. Colleen?
Thanks, Cassandra. Welcome to everyone who's joined the call today. A quick note, we are recording this presentation and it will be available on the Diversity and Inclusion section of the CIM website. So please feel free to check it out online and share it with your colleagues. I'm joined today by 4 panelists, all leaders in their field from a range of industries: oil and gas, power utilities, including hydro, nuclear, renewables. I'm really excited to hear their thoughts on the topics we'll be discussing today, and we're very lucky to have them joining us from across Canada. In terms of the format for the session, we'll start with introductions. We'll move into a discussion with the panelists for about 35 or 40 minutes. And then we'll give our panelists an opportunity to share some closing comments before we start the Q&A with the audience members using the chat function, as Cassandra mentioned. So we'll start with an introduction of the speakers, and just a note that their full biographies are available on the CIM event webpage, and the link is going to be posted in the chat as well. But we'll start by highlighting some of their impressive accomplishments, moving from eastern provinces to the west, where I am based in Calgary. We'll start with Margaret Kennequanash. She is the CEO of Wataynikaneyap Power, also known as Watay Power. It's a transmission entity majority owned by 24 First Nation communities in partnership with Fortis Inc. and other private investors. Watay Power is bringing grid connection to 17 remote First Nation communities in Northern Ontario. Margaret received the Executive of the Year Award at the Anishinaabe-Aski Development Fund Business Awards and the Emil Nakogi Award for Outstanding Leadership presented by the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation. Under her leadership, Watay Power received the First Nations Business Award of Excellence at the Northern Ontario Business Awards in 2020. Margaret is the first female chief in her community at North Caribou Lake First Nation. Welcome, Margaret. Ian Jacobson is the Director of Indigenous Relations at Ontario Power Generation. He spent more than 10 years working on Ontario's energy sector, including transmission and distribution, water power and nuclear generation. His work has focused on building strong collaborative relationships with Indigenous communities and businesses. He's a proud father of 3 and a member of the Mohawks of Kanesatake First Nation, located by the Lake of Two Mountains in southwestern Quebec. Thanks for joining us, Ian. Now over to Saskatchewan. Wayne Rood is the Director of Indigenous Relations for Sask Power. For almost 30 years, Wayne has worked with and for First Nations and related institutions in Saskatchewan. These roles included financial management, strategic planning, and land acquisitions. Sask Power successfully certified as a PAR Gold certified company with the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. Wayne is the Vice Chair for the Indigenous Relations Community at the Canadian Electricity Association. Nice to see you again, Wayne. And over to Alberta, where I am as well. Trent Zacharias is the Director of Community and Indigenous Affairs at Cenovus Energy. He's responsible for leading the company's efforts in working with Indigenous communities, municipal governments, and nonprofit organizations. Trent and his team guide Indigenous business development, consultation and engagement, community benefit agreements, and work on Cenovus's Indigenous Housing Initiative. Trent serves on committees involved with Indigenous and community matters, including the Board of Directors for the nonprofit Inside Education. Thanks for being here, Trent, and welcome again to all of our panelists. So we do want to dive right into the conversation today. We've got an hour and we've got a Q&A section as well. So please feel free again to log your questions and comments in the chat function. I'd like to start right at the top with the title of this seminar. So many of our participants here on the call today, I think, would really like to understand, what does Indigenous inclusion mean in the context of business today? I think they want to understand if their companies are sort of merely meeting expectations, or whether they should be pushing for a more progressive approach, perhaps in their own companies, to keep pace with other industries. So Ian, if we can start with you, as I mentioned, you've been with OPG for more than a decade. Can you give us an idea of what inclusion looks like day to day at OPG? Is it primarily sort of project focused, as it sometimes tends to be in some industries, or are you getting to the point where it's infused more into the fabric of the company?
Yeah, thank you, Colleen. It's a great question. So, I've been in the electricity sector in Ontario for gosh, almost 15 years now, if I'm counting, which I don't like to do. And throughout that time, I've seen a huge shift. When I started, if you had an Indigenous relations policy or an Indigenous procurement strategy, that was leading edge, right? Like 15 years ago. And that's table stakes right now. And I think most of us are really doing those things. So from an inclusion perspective, it's really from a holistic approach. And it starts from OPG with our Indigenous relations policy. And this is one of a handful of board level policies that incorporates a number of pillars around proactive community engagement, capacity building, employee engagement, as well as business and procurement aspects. So, we are a 100-year-old company that's been proudly producing energy for the people of Ontario since that time. And I think as a company, it is ingrained in our DNA and how we do things. And it's incorporated on how we operate as a business, and from our strategic planning, from annual business planning. The Indigenous relations aspect is a conversation throughout that. So.
Okay. So in that sense, how would you say when you as a company are being progressive enough? How do you measure that?
That's great. I mean, there's a number of indicators. I think there's some pretty good standards there in terms of, how many, what are you doing in terms of recruitment and retention? So we certainly look at the number of Indigenous employees that are working in our company. Our assets, are across Ontario on the traditional and treaty lands of Indigenous people. And our company needs to reflect the communities that we operate in. So certainly that's one of the indicators. On the procurement side, we look to see on how many contracts are being awarded to Indigenous businesses, how much outreach have we done, how are we progressing that aspect. And then certainly on the projects, we're really proud of our Indigenous partnerships. We were able to, over the past 10 years, we've developed 3 new hydro stations and 1 solar facility in partnership with communities. So certainly that's something that we're very proud of and reflective of our approach. It's, I think reflective of the mutually respectful and mutually beneficial relationships we're trying to establish with communities.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Ian. Margaret, maybe we'll bring you in here. You're coming from a unique perspective on the panel. You're looking at it from both sides in terms of running an Indigenous-led operation that also at the same time serves your community. So from your perspective at Wate, can you give us an idea of what meaningful inclusion of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous businesses can look like today?
So when we Miigwech, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge our Creator for giving us life, as well as acknowledge the missing Indigenous and murdered women today, as we think about them in the spirit world, as well as our ancestors who have paved the way for us. So as we talk about inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the business world, how did we do that in Wataynikaneyap? And one was a way of creating a vision by our First Nations in terms of how are we going to secure opportunities from the lands and resources, as well as pursuing economic development and energy while protecting our environment, maintaining our people's responsibilities to the land, as well as given to us by a Creator. So it meant, it means understanding our elders' teachings in terms of the principles of our inherent rights given to us by our Creator. Also our culture, traditions, values, those will never change. We're here to stay. And how do we exercise our economic thrust as we move forward in partnership and discussions that we're putting in place in the development of Wataynikaneyap project. So one of the things that we've also looked at is how are we ensuring, that our Indigenous people continue to exercise their Aboriginal treaty rights according to the spirit and intent of the treaties that they've signed. There's typical arrangements, for example, that companies like to do, they call it impact benefits agreement, compensation. But when we started talking about that, we said, what is it that we need to do? How do we reinforce ourselves as Indigenous people in the business? And we were instructed by our elders to work within the first law of the Creator and to follow our protocols. And that's what we use as we deal with our land users in the area and with our communities. And the other part of it is understanding the business and the corporate world. So there's many examples of what that means. And as well, knowing and developing clear expectations. The directive of meaningful participation involvement, what exactly does that mean? And how are we going to implement that as Indigenous people? And how are we going to ensure that our partners, our contractors are following through the premise of those discussions that we're having in developing that partnership to have meaningful participation involvement in accessing business, economic opportunities, building capacity through employment training, and even as far as what are some of those decision-making processes that we need to put in place. The most important thing and the premise of the partnership that was developed within Wataynikaneyap is having an equity, to have a level playing field in opportunities. And not only to think about today, but to be visionaries. What I mean by that is any opportunities that we grasp today must benefit the future generation and protecting our resources for our future generations as well. So the premise of any discussion that we have is based on the guiding principles that have been given to us by our leadership in the communities and ownership of the project.
Right. Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, I think it's really an indication of where things are going when you talk about guiding principles and community building, creating a vision for how to secure these opportunities. And then to hear Ian talking about, the holistic approach at OPG and making sure that inclusion is infused into all aspects of the business. And I think it speaks to our next point. We've been seeing in recent years a trend toward deeper and more meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities and corporate Canada. Canada. Now, the success of those initiatives are a matter of opinion, but I think we can certainly see that there is a drive toward that deeper and more meaningful engagement. Many refer to this as economic reconciliation in one sense. So my question is how does a company know when it's ready to move beyond that impact benefit agreement stage that you mentioned, Margaret, at the project level, and to take on a concept like reconciliation or economic reconciliation? And Trent, maybe we'll start with you here, because Cenovus took a massive step in this direction with a $50 million investment to build new homes for 6 First Nations and Métis communities near your oil sands operations in northern Alberta. Can you give us some insights into how the company made that decision, and why did you make it?
Sure. Thank you very much, Colleen. Yeah, and this is, I have to say, this is a topic that I could talk all day about. I was really excited about the housing initiative, and I would say at Cenovus, investing in Indigenous communities near our operations and ensuring that they can share in the benefits of resource development has always been a part of what our company was focused on. And that could be through economic reconciliation, such as you mentioned, Colleen, which includes business opportunities, or broader reconciliation efforts such as the Indigenous Housing Initiative, which I'll talk a little bit more about now. And really how that came to be was our CEO, Alex Porbay, shortly after he joined the company, one of the first things that he wanted to do was get out and visit some of the Indigenous communities that were closest to our operations. And through that engagement, it became really clear to us that many of our key communities were struggling with housing and homelessness. And as neighbors, they needed our support. And I'll say one of the things that was one of the biggest learnings for me in that, and I'd been working with some of those communities for 15 years at that point. And while I understood that quality of housing was certainly an issue in their communities, along with Indigenous communities right across this country, what I didn't understand was the degree of homelessness. And it was because homelessness in these communities that we were working with looked very different than what I think most of us think of when we think of homelessness. And it's really because communities, they won't turn their back on people, right? So homelessness in the Indigenous communities looked different in that you weren't seeing it. It wasn't visible. It would mean going from house to house, or maybe staying at a relative's or a friend's. And, as one of the leaders described to me, couch surfing. And in some of those communities, the homeless rate was up to 30% of their population, which is just a staggering amount of people to be without homes. So in January of 2020, we decided that we wanted to do something about it. And it really was right at the executive level, right from our CEO said, this is something that we have to do something about. And so we committed $50 million over 5 years to build homes in 6 of the communities adjacent to our oil sands projects. 4 of them are First Nations communities. So that'd be Beaver Lake, Cree Nation, Chippewa and Prairie First Nation, Heart Lake First Nation, and Cold Lake First Nation, and then 2 Métis communities, the Chard Métis and the Conklin Métis. And I would add, it's the largest community investment initiative in our company's history, and so we were thrilled to be able to announce that with our community partners. And even though I think for all of us, 2020 took a drastic turn to where any of us would have thought that it would have went in January due to COVID, we were still able to get the program off the ground and start construction. And our intent in going through this is, if the program is successful and meets our expectations and meets communities' expectations, we've said all along that our full intent is to make this a 10-year, $100 million initiative. One of the other really important things about it is it's not just about building homes. It's also about training and skills development. So we also partnered with one of the local colleges, Portage College, who they really specialize in working with Indigenous communities on training and education. And so there's a construction readiness program that we're doing in parallel to this. So I'll just talk a little bit about the construction just to give everyone a sense of what we were able to accomplish in 2020, which again, I have to give full compliments to the community because it was a very trying year. And to build any homes under the circumstances that they were facing is incredible. And yet we were able to stand up 12 homes. We also, work closely with communities because we aren't physically building the homes, the communities are. And so we're there to support them, and we were able to leverage, say, our supply chain management processes to negotiate decreased rates on things like appliances, which over the term of the 5-year program will save enough money to build 2 additional homes. And just, a ton of different successes. And then the one final piece that I do want to highlight, because I think initiatives like this cannot be successful without partnership and without commitment from others, whether it's government or post-secondary institutions. And one of the really nice surprises last year that to me is probably one of the biggest successes of the program was the 2 Métis communities are hamlets within a municipality. And so while the First Nations had access to land, those 2 communities did not. And so the first thing that we had to tackle together was finding residential lots in those 2 communities. And full marks to our partners at the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo, who, when they learned about the initiative, they wanted to be a part of it. And so with those 2 communities, they actually contributed land for a very nominal sum. In the end, I think it was $1 that they contributed the land for the residential houses. And so it was a huge win for the community and a huge win for the initiative.
And it looks like our moderator, Colleen, may have had some technical challenges. I don't see her on the call anymore, but I thank you for sharing that. That's a really powerful story of the success and the value of true partnership and true working together, and especially leveraging the supplier relationships already existing in the communities, coming from within a larger company as well. I know sometimes it's easy to make assumptions that we already have the connections we need. Colleen, welcome back.
This is a pandemic classic. This is the first time I've been booted off a call with more than 100 people on it. So I'm so sorry, Trent, that I missed your answer. I caught the tail end of it there. And so are we still, can you just give me a bit of a brief of where we are in the conversation, Cassandra?
Yeah, no, Trent was just sharing with us about their success with the housing initiatives. And I believe there's also some success stories that perhaps Ian would be able to reflect on in a similar nature.
Absolutely. Yes. So Ian, in your first question there, you did mention the equity partnerships that OPG has with Indigenous communities. I think, Lac Seul is a great example, Lower Matagami, the Nanticoke Solar Project you mentioned. Can you give us an idea of, as you've said yourself, that so much has changed in the last decade or so or more. Were these equity partnerships undertaken with the express intent of economic reconciliation? Because it's a fairly new concept. Can you tell us how that might have evolved at OPG?
Yeah, for sure. And I think just the whole concept of reconciliation, really the story starts well before our partnerships. As I mentioned, we are a 100-year-old company, and we have over 66 hydroelectric facilities, 2 nuclear facilities, and 1 solar. We know that we, as a company, our history with Indigenous communities is not great. It's not a great story. The impact related to flooding, in relation to the construction operation of the hydro facilities, had devastating impacts on communities. And so, as a company, we really took those first steps on the path to reconciliation before it was the buzzword we know it to be today. We adopted a policy in 1994, 1995 to start addressing some of these historical grievances related to flooding. And it was a difficult process. It was challenging conversations, but more than anything, we did a lot of listening. And in working, through a non-adversarial process with communities to come to an understanding of what those impacts are, and working collaboratively to identify solutions to those, it really paved the way in terms of allowing us to be forward-looking. So taking the time to address the past with the communities allowed us to look forward. And some of those conversations included partnerships. So, you know, were these developed under the reconciliation? Absolutely. You know, the communities brought a lot of value to these partnerships. So, you know, we often say this isn't just the right thing to do, it makes really good business sense in a lot of cases. So, you know, like I said, they were, we're so proud of these partnerships, you know, and from a, I guess, a commercial standpoint, obviously these are beneficial for the OPG, but for our Indigenous partners as well, because this brings long-term revenues for the community that can be reinvested into further economic opportunities, reinvested into community priorities. And, you know, it speaks just to the unique nature of our relationships with communities that's evolved over the last 20 years, where, well, let's be frank, like we weren't a consideration, right? 20 years ago when you were building. Back now that we, you know, we're in boardrooms and we're sitting, you know, at the table as partners. So it's really great to see, and frankly, it's one of the reasons why I joined OPG when I did. Is just looking at the really innovative stuff they were doing around project development and the economic reconciliation. So it's great to see.
Okay, Ian, if you could give us, you know, the top 2 or 3 key learnings after, you know, this number of equity partnerships that you have at OPG, what would you say those are?
Oh gosh, there was so many lessons. Those top 2 or 3. I mean, I think first of all, it's important to take the time to understand each other and to really understand the community. You know, if we're hearing, well, man, you only come to talk to us when you want something or need something, or, you know, you have to consult, then we're not doing it right. You know, so you know, taking the time to sit down, understand the communities, understand the perspectives, understand the issues, understand the opportunities certainly has been helpful. We took a lot of time in some of these partnerships to ensure that everyone working on the partnerships had some level of cultural acumen to understand, you know, the culture, the history, where the communities are coming from. And I think where one of the lessons learned is also there was opportunity to provide some education awareness about our culture, right, from a regulatory framework and a commercial framework, because it's also important and part of that capacity building. So I think, you know, these things take time. Sometimes your project schedule isn't necessarily the community schedule, and it's important to understand that up front and to be flexible and to work, you know, to really meet the communities on where they're at and to work together to build that capacity.
Right.
So I don't know if that answered the question or not.
It did, absolutely. Thanks, Ian. I think I'm not just speaking for myself when I say, you know, many of us can struggle to keep up with the pace of change on projects, trying to advise teams on the best way to build working partnerships between proponents and Indigenous communities. Margaret, maybe we'll come to you again. You've been building a landmark business partnership between 24 First Nations, as we mentioned at the top, Fortis and government, you know, basically from the ground up with Watay Power. Some might think that you would come to the table with a fully baked kind of community engagement plan, having seen throughout your career what works and what doesn't. But of course, that's not the case. And we learned that when we chatted with you a week or so ago. Can you tell us a bit about how you approached this project from the start to make sure the right community voices were heard?
Mm-hmm. I'll try to give you a highlight of some of the important work that has developed over the years. So energy has been a regional issue in our homeland for the last 16 years prior to Watay-Niqiyat, and Watay-Niqiyat has now been 14 years. So we've had numerous meetings with our leadership and communities from 2007 to 2012, talking about how are we going to partner in this project, and is this going to be a priority, and how are we going to make it work. And in 2012, a partnership agreement had been signed. So it's been 30 years that, we have energy discussions in our region, and it's many years of this discussion and engagement that's happened. In parallel to that, we had to ensure that governments, especially Ontario, make this a priority issue, and that because of the nature of the project and the need and the vision for the project, it was very important to make sure that this become a priority project, which would be part of their long-term energy plan. So one of the things that we've done is to look at from a business perspective to find a right partner, and that supports your vision and creating a successful partnership. So we went and looked at 7 major utility companies across Canada, and the current requirements within government regulatory regime is any transmission company is to have a license, financial ability to be able to build, operate, maintain, and but it does not have First Nation ownership. So we went out and secured proposals that would focus on that in terms of how is our partner going to enable that vision, and how are we going to make sure that our partner supports that. And we received a lot of proposals. There was a lot of different responses. Some said no, others said 80-20, others said, well, no, we'll do the 51%, you can have minority. And but we found a partner that supported the vision, enabled us to move forward, and that was Fortis. So we are very grateful for that, for the support and help that they provided us. As well, there was a lot of education and awareness that we had to do within the project. And it's a huge learning curve, understanding the energy sector, because it's a really highly complex regulatory regime, what we call energy in Ontario, and sharing that information to our people and translating it in our language so that people can make informed decisions, as well as educating government and industry about our people and their needs. We often think that everyone in Canada would understand our people, but it's really truly amazing once you go out there and start talking about your communities and the situations in your communities. People don't really have a clue who you are, which is really sad, because that's not what it should be about. We're talking about reconciliation and moving forward. We have to start being responsible in that area, and how are we going to do that? And sometimes time is not on your side. As Ian said, the communities, they have their way of doing business and doing things, the communication, engagement. From a business perspective, that's also very challenging. So understanding each other's priorities as partners, eliminating misunderstandings, and how we move forward together. And of course, as we know, the protocols of our people, those teachings that we have from our elders, are also different from a business perspective, because those don't always go hand in hand. Sometimes, it puts you in a position where it's conflicting. And sometimes as we work on this with the communities, with government, with regulatory regimes, and also legislation, all at times, we had to go out and ask for policy supports, changes, in order to enable the vision to move forward and to build that project for the community. So balancing traditional knowledge, human resources development, and business needs are so critical. And having the ability to be able to understand, communicate, and understand each other's needs as partners is so important. Sensitivity and knowledge of First Nations culture and traditions. We do a lot of our educating with our partners, our contractors. From a First Nation side, they have to understand the business acumen. What is investment, and understanding and gaining knowledge of business development. So the other expectations from our people is, in order for their voices to be heard, they want to see the senior management at the community level. When we were able to travel, but COVID-19 right now prevents us from doing that. As well, visibility of partners in the community is so important, because it does provide some reassurances to our communities that our partners are here. They're coming to see our communities. They're willing to work with us, and contributing to, certain community events or initiatives is also very welcome by our people, and a willingness to understand, the cultural differences and language barriers. So there's lots of things that can be done to make it to make it a project, and to be able to advance the project to become a viable project.
Right. To pick up one of those threads there, Margaret, you mentioned that the protocols from your communities from a business perspective can be quite different, and you mentioned community members wanting to see senior management there. If you could give one tip to the people on the call in terms of how they can better understand how the business protocols would be different, what might you suggest?
There's a number of things that we talk about. Is the body language is one. Body language is also very important to our people, because there's certain things that our people will do in terms of also acknowledging the traditional offerings, what those are, respecting those, also being able to provide appropriate information to the people in terms of where the project's at and how we're moving forward is also very key, so that people know what is going on. So there's just a number of protocols that we must follow in the teachings that we receive. A lot of us Indigenous people don't put these in writing. It is a practice. It's something that we do, and we learn from each other, and we share with each other. And as we have partners, we also teach them as they go into partnership with us.
Thank you. Wayne, I might pick up on another thread of what Margaret said and maybe bring it over to you. Margaret mentioned, sometimes feeling a bit exasperated if there's a lack of knowledge about communities. And so I wanted to bring you in on the question of, some provinces and some industries may be relatively early in the journey of ensuring that Indigenous communities and businesses are really able to retake their place in the national economy. But in Saskatchewan, strong partnerships have been forming between, Indigenous communities and the mining industry, for example, as you've told us, over the last few decades. What changes have you seen during your time at Sask Power, and what opportunities and evolutions do you expect to see down the road?
I've seen incredible changes. Sask Power, we're a vertically integrated electrical utility. And so that means not only are Indigenous people there are rights holders or stakeholders, there are customers, right? And so generally, people at Sask Power are familiar with all the Indigenous communities, because we're in those communities operating our assets, delivering electricity. They are our customers, and we have this footprint in Saskatchewan that goes across the entire province in every single community. And so that gives us a bit of a unique perspective. But over time, what we've seen is a huge change. When I first started with the company really wasn't doing anything 12 years ago. And, where we are now, one of the things we really looked at was to do business and get into that procurement stream. We saw what was happening in the mining sector in Northern Saskatchewan. We saw the success of Indigenous business in Northern Saskatchewan, particularly in that uranium sector. And we just leveraged that for all we could. And, fast forward, this year, last year, we had our biggest year in Indigenous procurement, over 60 million. Since 2014, we've done almost $350 million in procuring goods and services. Indigenous companies and suppliers and communities, they are integrated into our supply chain. They are competing outright with non-Indigenous companies. They compete against each other. Their capacity continues to grow. And I think at some point, I'll be back here, if I'm still here, in 2030, we won't be talking about 300 million. We'll be talking about $1 billion that we've done. And so we're on a strong path. That's really supported in the company. When I first started, I felt like I was the only champion. And now I can point inside the company and say, I got 200 to 300 people that are champions in our organization. So I don't have to do the heavy lifting. One of the things that we are Park Gold certified company. And we just recently resubmitted to recertify. We use that as a catalyst and a rallying point for inside the company We have focus groups, we got working groups, we got people doing action planning on Indigenous relations. What are they doing to close the gaps? And all of this is just moving along very quickly. We've extended our influence to the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce and across the crowns and ministries in Saskatchewan. So we're kind of a leader, and we're actually stepping up and leading other organizations in Saskatchewan. You know, what I would not expect to see, or what surprises me, you know, our own board chair, our chair of the board for SaskPower is Chief Darcy Bear from the Whitecap Dakota Nation. He's our board chair in his second term. We recently just had the new chair of the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce is an Indigenous business leader in Saskatchewan. So the changes that I've seen are also being seen throughout Saskatchewan. And it's been really positive, and I don't see the momentum coming off of this at all. In fact, I think it's just going to continue to grow.
Right. And I think you and I have even had discussions about, you know, the challenge for proponents now to a certain extent is more along the lines of, you know, how can we meet the very high expectations of Indigenous communities for things like equity partnerships, maybe, you know, to a certain extent, those being seen as table stakes in some spaces. What does that mean for how you might approach new projects compared to your approach even 5 years ago? Because those expectations are so high now that you've got to come with your best offer.
Well, okay, so SaskPower will procure energy. Let's use, we'll say generation. Sometimes we build things ourselves and operate themselves, and sometimes we go to the market. What we're seeing is Indigenous companies and communities, they're bidding on these actively, and we're going to be seeing them win some of these major competitions. They're going to be, we're going to see ownership of major generation before my time is done here. Even today is a sod turning ceremony for a 10 megawatt solar project in partnership with a solar vendor, as well as George Gordon First Nation and Star Blanket Cree Nation. I mean, so that's happening today. They're starting construction. There's another project. We have the Meadow Lake biomass plant. It's fully under construction right now, and it's advancing. And that's you know, Meadow Lake Tribal Council, again, real leaders in Saskatchewan and even in Canada. They own, you know, the largest forestry sawmill forest operations in Saskatchewan, and this just dovetailed right into their operations and actually helped them alleviate environmental liability. So again, we continue to work pretty hard, and I would say our executives are really strong advocates. They are out there, they meet with people, they attend ceremonies. I think people are really opening up into what are the possibilities with Indigenous people and communities in our business over the long term. And it's exciting.
Absolutely. Trent, I might bring you in on the same question because you've set a high bar in Alberta with the Indigenous housing project as one example. So how might you target or approach projects differently than you did perhaps 5 years ago because you've set your own standards now?
Well, I think it's really building on the successes that are there, and I think what you know for Synovus, economic reconciliation is really a huge part of our interaction with Indigenous communities, and that's not just the choice by us as a company. That's what the communities are also telling us is important, and it's something that they've really been telling us since we first started developing some of our major projects, and so we've really put a lot of effort and time into that. And so an example of that is since 2009, our company has spent over $3 billion with Indigenous businesses. And recently we acquired Husky Energy, and use of Indigenous businesses was also ingrained within the Husky culture. And so I think while that deal certainly increases the size of our company, it also increases the size of the potential opportunity and the things that we can do with different Indigenous communities. I've heard every speaker today say it in a slightly different way, but we are at a place of transformation in terms of the relationship that corporations, governments, Canadians in general have within Indigenous people. I think that is extremely clear, and I completely agree with that. And when I look at our company in particular, I know that transformation is going to continue to occur. And there's really there's kind of three key areas where I see that happening and continuing to grow. The first is we're going to have to change where and how we spend our dollars with Indigenous businesses. So when I look at that $3 billion in spend that we had since 2009, well, our business has changed. That was largely based on building very large capital intensive projects. We're now at a place where we're operating and sustaining. And so we're going to have to see those community businesses transition to the types of support and services that lean more towards operations and sustaining. I think the second thing, and we've heard, I think everybody talk about it today, was equity-based partnerships with Indigenous groups, where they're partners and they're bringing both funding and expertise to the table. I think that's another trend and a change that we're going to continue to see, and we're certainly, we've said we're open to that. And then I think the last thing is that and it's also a type of partnership, but I think we can and should see more partnerships that include industry, community, and government together. And I think those types of partnerships are critical. And it doesn't matter whether it's business or whether it's something like the Indigenous Housing Initiative, which, you know, one of the biggest bits of feedback that I got when we launched that initiative was, and it was from communities and you know, industry and even government saying, well, this isn't something that industry really typically steps into. Why are you doing that? And I think there's going to be more of those kinds of things. But I think for them to be successful, you need three parties at the table to drive those kinds of initiatives forward. And then the last thing I would highlight, and this is really specific to Cenovus, is we have an Indigenous Inclusion Advisory Committee that is comprised of senior leaders from across the company, all the key decision makers. It's chaired by an executive team member, and they are going to continue to be critical in knowing and understanding and shaping the strategy and the plans of where we want to go as an organization with our Indigenous relations practices, and then embedding it and continuing to embed it throughout the company.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've witnessed as well, just in the last 5 years in particularly, so much has changed with senior leadership taking on critical roles to ensure that that this becomes a strategic priority. And it's not just, you know, as Wayne mentioned, you know, years ago it was him kind of leading the charge, and now, you know, he's seeing a team and adoption across, you know, all levels of an organization. What I might do, we're getting a lot of questions from the participants of the call. So what I'd like to do now is shift over onto question mode, take some questions from the audience, and then save about 4 or so minutes at the end for all of the panelists to give their closing remarks, if that works for everyone. I'll start with a question addressed directly to Margaret. So Margaret, some companies have a sincere desire to work alongside communities to deliver a project under a community lens and vision. Unfortunately, some do not have the same intentions. How did you assess and decide which companies are going to partner with you on Wate and on other Indigenous-led projects? And you gave us a bit of insight into the choice of Fortis. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think when we looked at an evaluation process, we started looking at initially the what is it that we're supposed to do to become a transmission company. Our First Nations gave us 2 mandates. One is to connect remote First Nations to the transmission grid, and the premise of doing that was to include ownership. And then as we developed that directive in terms of ownership, we went out and looked at pre-development partners initially, and after 18 versions of master service agreement, it kind of fell through. Development of master's agreement in terms of how the partnership was going to move forward, it fell through. So we went back to the drawing board and said, okay, what is the expectation of a transmission company? What is the regulatory requirement to become a transmission company? And I think I gave examples in my speech earlier that, you know, you have to have a transmission license, you have to have the money, and you have to know how to build a transmission line. You have to operate and maintain. One thing that it didn't have is First Nation ownership and involvement. So the regulatory regime did not allow for that, but that was the expectation and the premise of our leaders in moving forward with this project. And as we went along and we looked at that, we also did a market sounding, study to see what sort of interest is happening out there. We worked with Infrastructure Ontario on that to see what sort of interest is out there. And then from there, we went out and, did the expression of interest to see if there is people. And quite a lot of people, brought in their proposals. And the initial proposal, we received these really, really thick binders of proposals, 300-page proposals with lots of fillers in them. But then we went the second round as we were looking at engaging a partner in transmission. We said, what are we going to focus on? And it's going to be focused on based on the mandate and directives of our leadership, and then moving forward, getting that response and requirements. So we did a request for proposals. And what we said is, don't give us 3-inch binders full of fillers. That's not what we want. We want you to tell us, how are you going to enable that vision of our people to work with us to be able to have ownership in this transmission company? That's how we move forward on that.
Okay, thank you so much, Margaret. Next question is regarding the pandemic, and Ian, maybe I'll ask you to participate in this one, as we were going to cover this topic later and we decided to move directly to questions, so we've got some overlap there. The question is, how do you anticipate that the pandemic will affect work in this space of Indigenous inclusion and change the landscape of Indigenous inclusion?
No, it's a great question, and we're sort of living through this right now. So certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, when people started working from home and band offices was closed down, there was a bit of a quiet period, although we were quite busy working with communities in which we were engaged with on projects. But I've seen the shift. I mean, I think we're all more comfortable in having these types of conversations on Skype or on Zoom, and certainly for a little while, a few of our negotiations and some other critical conversations were put on hold as communities really took time to address their key priorities and ensuring that their communities keep safe. So, we did see a bit of a pause, but I'm actually quite surprised. We were able to continue engaging with communities on consultation activities. I'll give you one great example is, we were working with the Algonquins of Ontario on a small hydro redevelopment. Typically you would have community members as ARC monitors kind of supporting the archaeology work. Because of the pandemic, their community members weren't able to join the archaeologists. So what we did was live streamed the archaeologists walking on site with communication with the AOO. And so they were able to see what the archaeologist was doing and seeing and getting to stop, or, you have to be creative and innovative. So we're trying to find ways to do that. Certainly we are constantly in conversations with the communities to understand what the key issues are, key priorities are. PPE was a huge issue and concern and need for not only communities, but everyone. So given its scarcity, we were able to supply, work with the Ontario government and the Ministry of Health to provide face shields that OPG had manufactured, and working with government to distribute those to communities across the province, as well as Indigenous organizations who had frontline workers supporting community members. So absolutely, we're seeing that one shift. But I'm quite surprised, though. I think that, again, we're getting comfortable to having sometimes tough conversations over video in front of computer monitors. But we know, this thing, hopefully we'll see the end of the pandemic, and I know we're all looking forward to getting back to normal. We say when you're doing this type of work, when you're, practicing this work, the face-to-face engagement, the in-person engagement is always the best. I mean, you can't get around that. But in the meantime, I think we're all trying to make the best, including communities, to advance conversations, to advance initiatives and projects, in spite of the challenges.
Yeah, I think there are huge opportunities to just make sure those lines of communication are staying open year round, especially for remote communities. If you can't get there, the challenges related to actually getting into that face-to-face mode. Everybody seems to be growing more comfortable with the online meeting, except me, of course, because I couldn't even stay on this call for the full duration without kicking myself off somehow. Um, we've got a question on the topic of education. I'm an educator at a post-secondary institution with students entering or from the energy sector. What's the role of education in this conversation? What should non-Indigenous students be exposed to? So maybe we'll start with the first part of the question. Wayne, maybe you can chime in here in terms of the role of education in this conversation.
Well, I think in education, I mean, we're seeing a transformation in the energy sector, right? In not only in Saskatchewan, but in Canada and worldwide. Obviously, students need to be aware of what's coming, right? The world is changing quickly, and they need to understand the aspiration of Indigenous people and communities. Communities don't want to see the cost of energy put the sustainability of communities at risk. They are going to be looking for solutions. We see a move and a desire towards independence, especially on the electricity side. I mean, I think they want to have the future in their own hands and not be relying on service providers. So I think you're going to see a big shift in their capability, their capacity, their desire to move forward and take their place in Canada, both in the economy and in the sustainability of their own communities. And that's something that should be brought forward in an education realm.
Thanks so much, Wayne. So we're down to our last 4 minutes here. We do have a question that I do want to address. It's a challenging question, and maybe I'll start with my thoughts as well. But then I'll invite the panelists to give their closing comments, and feel free to comment on this question if you'd like to. It is a challenging question. The question is: given that today is National Day of Awareness for Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, what are the actions your companies have taken to implement the calls for justice for industry and any lessons learned? I think I can kick this off and just saying that I have seen that topic has been a challenge for companies. I think the entry point that I've seen where companies can get involved and are starting to make progress and headway is when we look at the regulatory process and the Impact Assessment Act and federal government looking at issues of gender related to operations. That seems to be an entry point where we're seeing more engagement, because it is such a difficult topic. And just like any industry, companies can be reluctant to put their head up and take on this issue and be the one to get out in front of it. So I think I've in my years working on the energy side, I've seen small progress toward a willingness to address this issue and really internalize how it impacts their operations and their responsibility from a proponent perspective. Those are just my early thoughts. If anyone has any other comments, please feel free to comment. But in terms of wrapping up with some closing thoughts, Margaret, perhaps we'll start with you. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us as we wrap up the panel on the topic of the future of Indigenous inclusion and where you see this space moving in the next 5 to 10 years?
So when I take a look at where we're at today, I mean, to me, truth and reconciliation means building a new relationship. We've been talking about treaties and improving that relationship for many years. In our region, we signed a treaty 100 years ago. Implementation of that treaty, our leaders have been pushing. So it can't be lip service anymore. We all need to take action. So in order for our discussions to be meaningful and to provide tangible results for everyone, including our communities, our land-based jurisdictional rights must be recognized and respected. And that's a fact. The overall vision of our Indigenous people is to own, to have control, and play a majority role in any development that happens in our homelands, of course, with our consent. And part of our sacred responsibilities as Indigenous people is to protect the sustenance of our people in the homeland. So this includes benefiting from the economic wealth created from the homelands, as well opportunities that will allow our communities to create equity and access capital markets. We must be visionaries, as I said. I encourage our people to become visionaries, to build a solid foundation, not only for today, but we have to think about the future generations, not only Indigenous people, but everyone. To have meaningful participation and involvement is the only way to strengthen that new relationship, and as well, to deliver a positive and a satisfactory outcome. One thing that we're trying to do in terms of the question that was just had, in terms of how are we trying to create that awareness in terms of, providing a safe work environment for our workers, is one thing that we've engaged some initiatives there in terms of what are we doing to protect our women in the workforce. That's one initiative that we're undertaking right now. The other thing is through employment and training, we're going to be delivering an all-woman line course. As in August, there's going to be Indigenous women that will be participating to be trained for the power line course that we're putting on. So I think it's really, really important to include women in the workforce as well. The respect that we all deserve as Indigenous women in all the forefronts in the workforce, whether it's at the ground level, whether it's no matter what capacity you're in. It's not only just Indigenous women, all women in general. It's I always believe that that working together to make improvements, health and safety, to create safe work environment for everyone is so important to all. So in conclusion, I want to quote our elder that is working with us within the project and who's also advising us. He says, I wondered why our elders always talk to me about our laws, our ways. But now I hear the echo in my voice. This can be a reconciliation project. We have to go back and start applying Manadu Donachkewen, which is the Creator's laws. It won't happen overnight, but we have to start to work so future generations can do it. Jerry McKay. Anyways.
Thank you, Margaret. We really appreciate you sharing your perspective throughout the panel. Thank you so much. In terms of closing comments, Wayne?
Yeah, I think, just continue to educate our workforce, give those opportunities to education. So, our informed workforce will have a better understanding of why we do what we need to do. Just even in our Indigenous employees, I'm seeing these young Indigenous women that are emerging as leaders in the different business divisions. They're bringing their voice forward. They are comfortable giving an opening prayer to a meeting in their own language. These are internal, these are not external. They're able to interact with communities in their own language. Bringing that more into our workplace is the next evolution. We have it now, but I see it growing, and it's really going to change the culture of the organization.
Absolutely. Thanks, Wayne. Ian and Trent, we're slightly over, but some closing comments from you both, starting with Ian.
Sure. I'll just echo, the comments from Margaret and Wayne, and apologies, there's a little bit of commotion upstairs. Online learning is not going well today with the kids. So, I think the education piece is key. It's absolutely critical, and it's key to helping as an organization, helping us situate ourselves within the broader conversation of reconciliation. And that's rooted in our shared understanding of the treaties, what they're intended for, understanding the perspectives of the communities that we work for, and in conversation and collaboration communities, creating a vision of where we want to go as a company and as communities, as partners. And that's key. And one of the things we started when I started OPG was we added the employee education piece to the policy and created a program around that. And we've seen a tremendous amount of engagement across the company because people don't know. People don't know the history. And in some cases, we have second generation Canadians or first generation Canadians who are interested and want to learn and want to do what they can to advance the reconciliation work. So education is absolutely key. I'll leave it there.
Okay. We've got a quick second for you, Trent. I see Cassandra's
Sure.
coming on the screen here. Sorry for leaving you off.
I will be really short, but I'll just say, like, a lot of what I heard everybody talk about today is our collective efforts to contribute towards reconciliation. So I would just add that everything that I talked about today, that certainly we view it as our contribution to that, but all of the actions that we take also inspire actions in others, whether it's in our own company or people that are paying attention and watching. So I just wanted to show everybody this. I'm not sure if you can see this, but this is a poster that I received in the mail this week from a grade 4 student, my new best friend at the Edmonton Islamic Academy, who read about our Indigenous housing initiative and was inspired by that, and that a company would care enough to try to do something to make such a positive impact. And really, when I see things like that, that tells me that the efforts are working, not just within our organization, but that we are reaching outwards and touching other people. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
That's great, Trent. Thanks for the show and tell. I've never seen that on a session before. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone for sticking with us. Cassandra, over to you. And thanks
Yes.
to all our panelists.
And really simply that. Thank you, Colleen, for all your effort and energy in helping support this endeavor. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing the actions of your companies, your colleagues, the people you work with, and providing that inspiration and guidance for everyone else in this space. It's really appreciated. And I think I'm confident in speaking on behalf of the audience that it's been quite informative and very insightful. So certainly, with all being said and done, we are at time. We will close the session for today, and there will be another session coming up in June to close out the Indigenous webinar series on behalf of the CIM. So hopefully everyone will be able to join us there. Information will follow on the CIM website.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.